Before I, before I introduce our speaker, I am introducing Joyce Batten. Joyce is a longtime member of the League of Women Voters, and she will give us a brief introduction to the League and to its purposes. Joyce?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the October program of the San Fernando Valley Unit of the Los Angeles League of Women Voters of Greater Los Angeles. I'm Joyce Batten of the Valley Unit, and we're very glad to have all of you here with us today. I'm assuming that some of you in our audience may be new to the League, so in just a few words, I'd like to introduce you to who we are and what we do. Our organization dates back over 100 years when the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified and women won the right to vote. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization encouraging informed and active participation in government, working to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. Uh, we now would like to reintroduce Linnea,
Thank you.
who will introduce our speaker of today.
Thank you. Today we are honored to have Professor Ariela Gross as our speaker. Ariela Gross is a distinguished professor at UCLA School of Law. She is both a scholar and an activist. She researches American courts and their interpretation of racial identity throughout history. She has published highly acclaimed books on race in America as a social, political, and legal construct. Ariela Gross is also an activist. Her activism started early. As a graduating high school senior, Ariela Gross was selected for the Presidential Scholars Program. She led an effort to have presidential scholars sign a petition requesting a nuclear freeze. The petition was presented to President Ronald Reagan with signatures from 14 of the 140 honorees of that year. And her activism has continued. In August of this year, Professor Gross was one of the organizers of the letter Jews in Defense of UC. The letter is addressed to the Board of Regents. The letter denounces the Trump administration's misguided and punitive demand for a $1 billion fine to settle claims over alleged campus anti-Semitism. It asks the Trump administration to cease its attempt to deprive institutions of vital research funds. The letter denounces the withholding of funds in the name of combating anti-Semitism. Ariela Gross has said, "You can't negotiate with an extortionist." We welcome Professor Ariela Gross as today's distinguished speaker. She will open her remarks, and then she has asked that we participate in a conversation with our comments and questions. Please put those questions in the Q&A. Professor Gross.
Thank you for that introduction, Linnea, and thank you all for having me. I thought I might just give you a little bit of background, some of which will be familiar, of course, but honestly, the onslaught of events has been so speedy that it's easy for all of us to lose track. So I thought I'd give some background on this administration's attack on higher education, what's happened with various different institutions, and then talk about the University of California and UCLA in particular. The attack on higher ed began immediately in January with a flood of executive orders. The initial volleys were focused on so-called anti-DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that's a really misleading term for a variety of efforts both to roll back civil rights law and civil rights achievements, and also just efforts to erase entire histories of racism, and even more explicitly just to erase people of color and women from various government positions. So in January and February, the Department of Education sent a Dear Colleague letter to colleges and university. It interpreted current Supreme Court case law, including the recent Students for Fair Admissions decision that ended affirmative action in a very broad and misleading way that sometimes directly contradicted what the justices said, interpreting that decision to end all efforts to achieve racial diversity, even using race-neutral means, whereas the court had specifically distinguished between means and ends. They had said, you know, it might be a laudable goal to have a diverse society or a diverse class at the university, but you can't do it in a race-conscious way. You should look for other ways to get there. Whereas the Trump administration said, you know, that's not a good goal. In fact, if we see that you still have students of color, we think something might be wrong. The other thing, of course, that happened very early on in February was cutting funding across a wide range of government agencies. Some of this was DOGE. Some of this was after that, National Institutes for Health, Department of Energy, National Endowment for the Humanities. A lot of funding cuts that hit researchers directly at universities, but had big effects in universities because of the way university funding is structured, that each one of these grants also pays an overhead fee to the university. And so that government funding is a big part of how our science and medical research goes forward. So it's felt across the universities. And entire fields of research, like, for example, on the health of LGBTQ individuals, have lost all of their federal funding. And many of the federal funding agencies have lost many, if not most, of their expert staff as well. Sometimes grant cuts were based on keyword searches for suspect terms like diversity. So, for example, one researcher who had a big grant to study plant diversity found her grant completely cut. Another thing that happened broadly is that grant programs have been reoriented towards so-called patriotic education. This is in September of 2025. This directly affects my own field. I'm both a law professor and a historian. According to this executive order, patriotic education presents American history in a way that is accurate, honest, and inspiring, emphasizing a unifying and uplifting portrayal of the nation's founding ideals, highlighting the progress the United States has made, and affirming that dedication to America's core values is meaningful and justified. And so now you can still apply for National Endowment for Humanities grants, but only if they fall into a narrow band of topical areas, and they are very kind of jingoistic. Okay, then came threats to particular institutions and followed by settlements with particular institutions. I think probably most of us are familiar with the fact that Columbia University, University of Pennsylvania, and Brown University all reached settlements with the Trump administration. And these settlements were far-reaching. They varied in terms of the dollar amount that had to be paid. Columbia's, of course, was quite a large payment to the federal government, whereas Brown agreed on a much smaller payment to workforce training programs. But other aspects of the settlement directly cut into the freedom of the university to decide on policies regarding teaching, student life, and academic freedom. So, for example, admissions policies that were restricted by requiring test scores to be considered, sharing with the government admissions data that would include test scores and race, and pledging to limit and cut back on international students and to allow a lot of scrutiny of international students. Penn University had to restore, quote, misappropriated recognitions that had been to female athletes and apologies to female athletes for any recognitions that had gone to trans athletes. All the universities had to change their policies to affirm that there are only two genders and to deny gender affirming care to students. And some of these settlements, including Columbia's, involved putting certain academic departments into quote unquote receivership and appointing monitors to make sure that these these aspects of the settlement were kept. And if the monitors determined that they were not, then all of the cuts can be reinstated. Harvard University was the first to reject a demand letter and to sue the federal government. Separately, its faculty AAUP chapter sued, and the AAUP suit has been extremely successful. The demands made on Harvard included new speech restrictions on campus, the cancellation of all their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and a commitment to full cooperation with the Department of Homeland Security. In September, Judge Allison Burroughs ruled in favor of the AAUP in a very wide-ranging opinion where she found that the funding freeze was illegal retaliation to Harvard, that it violated Harvard's First Amendment rights, that the administration had failed to follow the procedural steps required by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that anti-Semitism was being used as a smokescreen for an ideologically motivated assault on the university. So that was a really important federal court opinion. Then, of course, came the compact that was offered to 7 institutions, a deal that they could receive favored treatment and federal funding in exchange for agreeing to many of the same kinds of things that Columbia had agreed to. A so-called new policy of institutional neutrality, which usually means that the university itself won't take a political position, thereby allowing its members to take any position on either side of an issue. The institution would stay neutral. But the compact interpreted that institutional neutrality would require employees, including faculty, in exchange in their capacity as university representatives to, quote, abstain from actions or speech relating to societal and political events unless the issues directly affect the institution. In other words, a very broad muzzle on faculty and staff speech regarding any issues of the day. A commitment not to consider race, gender, religion, or other characteristics explicitly or implicitly in admissions decisions. Again, this was a way of saying you can't even use, for example, an effort to increase socioeconomic diversity if one of your motivations might be that you would also achieve racial diversity. And conducting broad public assessments of the viewpoints of employees and students to determine that there is viewpoint diversity. In other words, that there are enough conservatives on campus. Potentially dissolving or taking over any departments that quote, purposefully punish or belittle conservative ideas. Adopting policies that recognize academic freedom is not absolute. Capping international enrollment at 15% of the undergraduate body while screening international students for their political views, requiring undergrad applicants to take the SAT and base admissions decisions on that. Committing to using lawful force and swift, serious, and consistent sanctions against campus protests. And of course, adherence to all of those conditions would be enforced by the Department of Justice. Anybody who was found in any university that was found in any way to violate the compact could lose all government benefits for at least a year and pay back any federal funding from the previous year. The good news is that 7 out of 9 universities rejected the so-called compact. That brings us to the University of California. So back in the spring, there had already been more than $300 million in cuts across agencies for the so-called woke research that was going on at the University of California. So in June, one of my colleagues at Berkeley, Claudia Polsky, who's also a college classmate of mine, clinical law professor at Berkeley, along with Dean Erwin Chemerinsky and several other faculty, sued on behalf of UC Berkeley and UC San Francisco researchers who had lost funding. And much more recently, that lawsuit was they were certified as a class of all University of California researchers. And so that meant that when UCLA was targeted by the Trump administration with this threat of $1.2 billion in cuts, and at that time, 584 million were in grants at UCLA were suspended on the spot, because we at UCLA were part of this lawsuit that originated at UC Berkeley. We're part of the class. Some of those cuts were restored almost immediately. In August, a federal judge ordered the Trump administration to restore funding. In August, it applied only to National Science Foundation grants, but in September, Judge Lynn added National Institutes of Health, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense grants. So actually, the grants that were suspended in the summer have almost all been restored. Again, thanks to faculty lawsuits. This is not the university itself. It's not the university administration bringing a suit, although we've been begging them to do so. This is a suit brought by a group of faculty and supported by the network known as the University of California Faculty Associations. So at the University of California, faculty don't have a union, but we have this faculty association, which is affiliated with both the American Federation of Teachers Union and affiliated with AAUP, the American Association of University Professors. So it's like our not a union. We can't collectively bargain, but the Faculty Association has been very active in bringing lawsuits and in advocating at the legislative level and with the administration. Separately, of course, you also may have heard that as part of an investigation of campus anti-Semitism and the protests last spring of 2024, the Department of Education demanded the names of hundreds of UC faculty who were in some way connected to allegations of anti-Semitism, including faculty who signed letters that condemned anti-Semitism or condemned October 7th. So from politically across a broad spectrum, it made the news recently when UC Berkeley informed faculty members, 160 people, that their names had been given to the federal government. The other UC campuses, administrations, including UCLA, have more or less admitted that they also gave faculty names to the government, but have not informed us if our name is on that list. Now, UCLA has not made public the letter from the Trump administration detailing the settlement offer that they made in exchange for restoring cuts, but it has been leaked to the media, and it includes many of the same demands regarding all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, admissions, collecting data on race and test scores, requiring the SAT, recognizing only two genders and not allowing gender affirming care. The same limits on campus protest and free expression. And the UCLA Faculty Association sued the UCLA administration, so now not the Trump administration, but sued the University of California to make the letter public, that we're a public university and this should be public. A federal court, actually now twice in the last week or two, has found in favor of the Faculty Association and given UCLA a deadline of tomorrow to make that letter public. And in the meantime, of course, as you also probably know, Governor Newsom has spoken up very strongly to the Trump administration, saying that we won't stand, we won't be intimidated, we won't settle, we'll fight back, etc. But the decision is ultimately he's just one member of the Board of Regents. The decision is ultimately with the Board of Regents and the president of the UC system. So faculty, along with alumni and students and many others, have been urging the regents to not to give in, not to reach a settlement. And as Linnea mentioned, I've been involved actually in two different aspects. One is because the excuse, or as one court put it, the smokescreen for all of this interference and attack on higher ed has been the allegation of campus anti-Semitism. And there is, I will say, widespread disagreement among Jewish faculty, students, and staff about how to define anti-Semitism, whether some of the slogans of the campus protests constitute anti-Semitism, how big a concern anti-Semitism on campus was last spring or is today. But widespread agreement that these cuts have nothing to do with anti-Semitism, and that what is being asked of the university is not related to protecting Jewish community members. So together with David Myers, who's a chair in Jewish history, we drafted and organized a letter from the Jewish community at UCLA that was also signed by other UC community members that said simply that we represent, a very diverse range of opinions, but stand together against the administration's demands. Separately, I've been involved with my law faculty colleagues in drafting a legal statement explaining why the threatened cuts were illegal, and urging the regents and the university president to fight back in court. And our statement was signed by law faculty from across the 5 UC schools, almost 200, which is honestly, I think, most of the law faculty. Law faculties are small. And I can talk more about why it's illegal, but for some of the same reasons that the judge found the Harvard demand letter to be illegal. It violates Title VI procedural protections, and violates equal protection and the First Amendment as well. So I think I will stop there and and see what, if you guys have questions, comments.
So we have several questions from Susan. But if you would like to raise your hand or type your question into the Q&A, please do. So Susan, thank you for these questions. The first one is, I have difficulty understanding why and how the President of the United States has the right to dictate to any institution of higher learning. Can you explain this?
Well, I think you probably know the answer here, right? Which is that the president is doing many things that he doesn't have a right to do. If what we're talking about is any plausible reading of the Constitution or federal law. So we do get into, I mean, to take sort of the best view of what the administration is doing. Say we want to take the most sympathetic view of what they're doing, you could say, look, federal funding isn't right. It's a privilege, and the federal government can decide where to put its money. But there's a doctrine called unconstitutional conditions, which says, you can decide how to spend the money, but you can't condition it on viewpoints, right? It's one thing to say, well, I want to put government funding here and not there, but not to say, and not to do so in a discriminatory fashion or based on viewpoint. So it will actually be a tougher case to fight if the administration going forward, right, says we're just not going to fund X anymore. It's very easy to make the case that it's illegal to cut money that has already been appropriated, already been given, et cetera. And it's the same thing that we're seeing on a larger scale with the way they've sort of taken a hacking knife to all kinds of federal programs, right? Where like cutting money for USAID that was already appropriated by Congress, and they're just not sending it. That's clearly illegal. But of course, we still have the prospect, even if that's reinstated, we have the prospect of all of the things that they can do prospectively that will be more difficult to attack. And so they do have, you know, the power of the purse. Uh, and I will say that they've been very creative in thinking about how to attack private institutions, threatening their tax exempt status, taxing their endowments at a, you know, uh, very high level. They're coming at private institutions in many different ways. A public institution like California, like University of California, and because it's in the state of California, which is relatively wealthy and solid blue, puts us in some ways in a better position than either a private institution or a public institution in a poorer state, a red state. And in some of those red states, of course, they've already had their yeah, I mean, if you look at what's happening in Texas and Florida right now, those public institutions are being destroyed with almost no help from the federal government. Their state government is doing that. So yeah, kind of long-winded answer, but
We like your long-winded answer, Ariela. So I'll jump in with a question. We know that the letter is coming out tomorrow, but you had mentioned that you have an inkling of what might be in it. Would you be willing to share some of that?
yeah, so it was reported in the New York Times. It was apparently leaked to the New York Times weeks ago, and it's a 10 or 12 page document, apparently single spaced. So I'm sure there's a lot in it, but what was made public sounded very similar to some of those earlier settlements with Columbia, Brown, and Penn. So a requirement of sharing admissions data that by race. So you have this irony, right, that the Trump administration says we don't want you to ever consider race in any way, even indirectly. But we definitely want you to start keeping a lot of statistics based on race so that we can make sure, basically, so we can make sure you don't have too many people of color. Um, and uh, and so we can correlate identity characteristics with SAT scores, with the implication being that admissions decisions ought to be based on test scores. And so that if the test scores, if the people with the highest test scores aren't all the people getting in, something must be wrong. At the moment, the University of California doesn't even require the SAT. So, I mean, that is not what admissions decisions are based on for anyone. But so admissions related, cutting all DEI programs, very broadly conceived. I mean, closing the women's center, closing, shutting down any affinity groups, all of that. Ending gender affirming care at the medical centers, and in all other ways, recognizing only male and female assigned at birth, sex assigned at birth. In addition, stringent limits on campus speech, including protest and the requirement of very stiff penalties for engaging in protest. limits on our so-called extramural speech outside the classroom. So I think that we could expect many of the same demands that were made of Harvard, of Columbia, and in the compact, right? I doubt there are any huge surprises.
So Sue's next question has to do with America's core values. I think that means she meant, like, who gets to define those? Is there some document somewhere that we can check off? Is this
Right.
institution following America's core values?
Well, and I think we've seen how this goes so far, right? To the extent that these executive orders about restoring truth and sanity to US history, that one was aimed at the Smithsonian. I mean, I've seen this up front, how it's working out at the Smithsonian. So we're all aware of some of the stories of, Harriet Tubman is erased from the website, the Tuskegee Airmen, um, images of an enslaved man from the National Park Service, the books from the Naval Academy Library. So there's a lot of simply erasure. Um, what I know from National Park Service historians, some of our great historic sites in the US are National Park Service historic sites. And in places that I've worked and researched, I mean, there were really wonderful folks who devoted their lives to presenting a really full and truthful picture of American history with its, you know, all the greatness and all the flaws, and they have been instructed really to take down anything, anything that portrays the US, that includes any kind of criticism, self-criticism, portrays anything negative that happened in the past, is highlighted and goes under review. And of course, the folks who are reviewing it are not trained historians. They are people with a checklist and a list of keywords. And some of those lists of keywords have been made public, and they include things like women. I mean, if it says women, let's take a closer look at that. I mean, so really, this is a very broad brush. And I think one of the other questions I see Susan raised is about, this seems to be in line with Project 2025. Absolutely. And I think Project 2025 and other of the so-called founding documents of this administration and the Heritage Foundation make it pretty clear, right, what they think the core values are. They're returning us to a white male dominated society that has not changed in the ways that they are uncomfortable with. And I should say that this is really that kind of erasure of history and kind of nationalistic patriotic whitewashing is really right out of the dictator's playbook. Like, Viktor Orban in Hungary, kill the independent universities, substitute a narrative of celebratory narrative without slavery. I think President Trump said the other day, we talk about slavery too much, how bad it was, just move on.
Right. We have a question from one of our students at Los Angeles City College. Yeshua wants to know how likely will the UC lawsuit win?
Great question. And so here's what I would say. Very good chance. I mean, the lawsuit brought by the Berkeley researchers has already had several victories in court and very strong opinions from federal judges. And this is true of the lawsuits against the Trump administration in general. I was just at a talk last night by the Southern California director of the ACLU. The ACLU has been bringing many, many lawsuits against the Trump administration. And most of the time in lower federal courts, we win. Even with Trump appointed judges. There was a remarkable opinion by a Trump appointed judge. Actually, I'm sorry, this one was a Reagan appointed judge. A Reagan, so he's a little older, a Reagan appointed judge who was considering the actions of the administration in sending troops into one of the cities. And this judge, before his opinion, he reprinted in the federal record hate mail that he received. And the hate mail said in this, like, it was like a postcard and handwriting, shaky handwriting. And it said, Trump has, I can't remember, Trump has guns or bombs and something else. What do you have? And he said, well, Mr. Anonymous, what I have is the US Constitution. Let me show you how it works. Then he gave his opinion. It was a 161-page opinion, just destroying the Trump administration's arguments. And at the end, he said, and this upholding the rule of law and the Constitution is going on in courtrooms across the country every day on my behalf and on yours, sincerely yours, Judge William Young. It's an amazing document. That said, if these cases, when these cases are appealed to the Supreme Court, as we know, the Supreme Court has been on its emergency docket. Some people call this a shadow docket. It has been deciding some of these cases appealed by the Trump administration on an emergency basis with no written opinion, no having to explain how they have reached this conclusion, and they've been finding in favor of the Trump administration. So we are in a situation where we can do a lot of good if you think that this campaign against university is a bad thing. We can do a lot of good in the courts, in the federal courts. We can bring hundreds of lawsuits and we can win almost all of them. But the 10% that are appealed and that the Supreme Court takes up, a good chance of losing, because right now the Supreme Court seems to be rubber stamping what President Trump wants to do, and that is very disturbing. So I think it's actually quite likely that if the UC administration sues, it will win, that the UC faculty lawsuit will win. But at this stage, we kind of just have to hope that our cases don't go all the way to the Supreme Court.
Thank you, Ariela. Heather Hanunian, Linnea, would you like to ask a question before I take Heather's?
Would. So I saw recently in September that Chancellor Frank said that the university would address valid Trump administration concerns. Do you see any of the Trump administration concerns as valid?
this is here just my personal opinion. I would say the only issue that I've seen raised by the administration that I think is something that, broadly speaking, universities need to address is tuition. The high cost of attending universities. This is a First of all, it's a very different question for public and private universities, right? For the University of California, that's really a political question for voters of how much they want to support higher ed and what the governor's priorities are. And because University of California is really tuition driven, and so it really depends on public funding. For private universities like my alma mater, Harvard, they have a funding model that involves a very, very high ticket price, and then many students who aren't paying the ticket price, or now a significant number who aren't paying anything at all. I happen to think that's a bad funding model that has not been successful at democratizing elite higher ed at places like Harvard. Um, there are more students from the top 1% than from the entire bottom 50%. So it's it's very skewed to the upper echelons, and it does perpetuate inequality. And I don't, however, think that I think universities have been trying, and private universities have been trying a number of ways to shift that. One of them is by raising the income level at which people will have to pay nothing at all. So at Harvard, that's now $200,000 a year. But certainly the way this administration is going about things, saying you have to freeze tuition for 5 years, just has nothing to do with addressing the problem of the cost of higher ed. So often the things that administrators are referring to when they say valid concerns are usually things I don't agree are valid concerns. So I can't really speak to them because I don't agree.
So Harvard is also my institution, and unfortunately, it feels like Harvard gets a lot of mileage out of its tuition-free offers to a small percentage of its incoming class. The other concern is that SAT scores are very often tied to the socioeconomic background of a family, so requiring or placing a lot of emphasis on SAT scores. And I think Harvard does automatically raises the economic level of students admitted.
Although it's really interesting, it turned out a lot of schools abandoned the SAT during the pandemic, and also as part of reform efforts after 2020 and kind of Black Lives Matter, and people were thinking about how can we diversify our student body and how can we achieve better socioeconomic diversity. And getting rid of the standardized tests, many of us thought was going to help with that. Some schools like MIT, for example, went back to the SAT because they found that although, yes, it's skewed to the upper part of the socioeconomic scale, it's less skewed than anything else they're using, because everything else is really skewed as well. And so they found that they were able to find more students using the test scores, allowed them to at least find that group of students who came from poor performing schools, lower income backgrounds, who outperformed, who did better than expected on the test, and that they just had no way of finding those students once they got rid of the test score. So I mean, I think the whole system is really disfavors.
So we ran into that when my daughter applied. I was a single wage earner, single mom, and she proudly listed all of the part-time jobs that she had had. And a Harvard admissions person said, every part-time job you list is a negative.
Oh my God, that's terrible.
Yes, it's a negative because it indicates financial insecurity. So students proudly list their accomplishments and they have their supervisors write letters, and it's decreasing their admission chances. So
Sure.
there's a lot about admissions that we don't understand, and how do we get to fair admissions? And it's
Yeah.
important because unless we get people into the pipeline of these elite institutions, they don't get into the pipeline of the grants and the professional schools that allow them to bring out different kinds of questions about our country, the questions that are being suppressed. So, yes, it's a real dilemma.
Sorry, I'm having a little contact lens attack here.
Well, while you take care of your contact lens, I will tell you about one more question that we have. We have someone who retired from UCLA, helping to oversee university funds, and she has not seen strong communication from UCs on endowments that are normally highly restricted by donors, can't be spent outside of those restrictions. And the government is paying universities to research what it wants to research. And while the university might conduct that research, it also incurs additional costs. Overhead rates are renegotiated every 5 years, and the government negotiates hard to minimize the rates. Can you speak to either of those things?
Sure. I mean, that was the first way that the Trump administration cut higher ed, was by raising the overhead rate across the board, more than doubling the overhead rate, I believe. And so that was an enormous hit to universities, that they, I'm sorry, not doubling, having, cutting what universities get on every grant. And so that cutting that rate has been a cudgel that this administration has used. And of course, that's completely correct, right? That this federal government university partnership has been extremely beneficial for the government and for the country as a whole. It was this was the post-World War II model of how to grow higher education, but also how all of this research would happen is that it would be based at universities. As of now, it appears as though what this administration is saying is simply, we don't care. We don't want research anymore. We don't want knowledge. We don't want vaccines. We don't want cures for cancer. We're just gonna whatever it is that Kennedy, RFK says, we're going to just have holistic healing instead, and they seem to be willing to just kill off research that has made the United States such a world leader. And I have to tell you, I just returned I was on a academic fellowship in Europe, and it's kind of shocking seeing the US from the outside perspective now. People who graduate students who expected to want to go and do some of their training in the US now wouldn't dream of applying for anything in the US. I mean, no, everyone looks over here just in shock, and they've completely reoriented towards the European Union. And that's true not only for Europeans, but for people from the rest of the world as well. Now their goal is to end up in Europe, if they can.
So we have one last question, and I think it's just obvious. Do you expect a legal challenge to the administration's letter? And then it will go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, at certain point, right, there are going to be a number of these, right? There's the case, um, the Harvard, Boston case, and there'll be a California case, and so it's certainly possible that um, that the Supreme Court could rule on these cases. I tend to think it's unlikely that they're going to want to take up um this particular issue. It doesn't seem like a great one for them, but I just have no idea. I teach constitutional law. I have no idea.
Well, Linnea, we have
Yes.
4 minutes left in the hour. Do you want to give Ariela an opportunity to say some things that maybe she didn't say in the beginning?
Well, I do see Penny has her hand up.
Oh,
Penny,
I'm sorry.
you have a question?
Yeah, can you send us off with kind of a glimmer of hope and something that the league can do and be involved in?
Um, sure. I mean, I really, to me, I think all of us were a little like in the deer in the headlights when all of this first started happening in January, right? All of, Elon Musk taking a wrecking ball to all of these government agencies and departments, and um, all of these executive orders being thrown our way, and ICE. I think we are seeing really encouraging signs of resistance popping up in a lot of different places. So I think the lawsuits are really important. Um, but I also think that there are many other ways here in Los Angeles. You can get uh, ordinary observers. You don't have to be a lawyer. You can get training to go down and observe um, ICE, and at immigration hearings, they need, people in courthouses around the greater metropolitan area. People are showing up just when they hear there's a raid, and oftentimes they're helping turn back what are clearly, illegal detentions of uh, persons without due process. There are, uh, we're seeing, things like even just the No Kings, 7 million people turning out on Saturday. Um, uh, Here in California, I think the state government's been the governor has been quite aggressive with Prop 50. I think that's a really important initiative to fight back against Texas and some of the really anti-democratic things that are happening in other states. So I think there's actually a lot happening. I think people aren't ready to just give in to authoritarianism. And just the fact that you all are organized in in this fashion means that there's the opportunity to work together on, whichever project seems most important at the moment. But I think the more we see that people all over are doing something, it's very empowering.
Well, I'm glad you've given us a good message, and many, perhaps everyone on this call is involved in some way in resisting this authoritarian creep. So we are very appreciative of your efforts and also of your time. So thank you so much for speaking to us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
We'll end the recording now, and we'll end the session.